The morning Peter packed his bags, he looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would echo in my mind for months. Natalie, you're just not enough anymore. I need a real woman. As he dragged his suitcase down our front steps, turning back one last time with that satisfied smirk, I stood in the doorway of our suburban Denver home, still in my pajamas, watching 8 years of marriage roll away in his black BMW. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly predicted, was that his real woman would eventually meet my replacement. And when she did, everything he thought he'd won would crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But let me start from the beginning, because the best revenge stories always require proper context. Before we dive deeper into this tale of karma in designer heels, I want to take a moment to connect with those of you who felt that particular sting of being deemed not enough. If you've ever watched someone you loved walk away, claiming you weren't what they needed, this story will resonate with you in ways you might not expect. Please consider subscribing. It's free, and it connects you with others who understand that sometimes being left behind is actually the universe clearing the path for something better. Now, let's get into it. Peter and I met during our senior year at Colorado State University. He was studying business, I was finishing my degree in graphic design. We were that couple everyone envied, homecoming king and queen energy, if you will. He was tall, confident, with perfectly styled brown hair and a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. I was the creative type, quieter but not shy, with auburn hair I kept in a neat bob and green eyes that Peter used to say reminded him of sea glass. We married 2 years after graduation in a ceremony at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. 200 guests, an ice sculpture, the works. My parents had saved for years to give me that wedding, and Peter's family, who owned a successful chain of sporting goods stores across Colorado, spared no expense. The photos from that day show a couple completely convinced they'd found their forever. For the first 5 years, we played house perfectly. Peter climbed the corporate ladder at a marketing firm downtown, while I freelanced from our home office, designing logos and websites for small businesses. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Highlands Ranch, complete with a 2-car garage and a backyard perfect for the children we planned to have someday. The cracks started showing around year 6. Peter began working longer hours, taking more business trips, and spending weekends networking at golf courses I wasn't invited to. When I'd suggest we start trying for a family, he'd deflect with talk about his career trajectory, about needing to be financially ready, about timing never being quite right. "You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under," became his favorite refrain whenever I tried to discuss our growing distance. "Your little design projects are cute, Nat, but I'm building something real here." My little design projects were actually bringing in nearly as much income as his salary, but pointing that out only seemed to irritate him further. I learned to keep quiet about my successes, to downplay client victories, to make myself smaller so his ego could expand comfortably. The transformation was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. The Peter who used to bring me coffee in bed became the Peter who complained if I wasn't awake early enough to make his breakfast. The man who once bragged about my creativity to his friends became the husband who rolled his eyes when I mentioned landing a new client. By year 7, we were roommates who occasionally slept in the same bed. He'd come home from his business trips with expensive gifts, a designer handbag I'd never carry, jewelry that wasn't my style, presents that felt more like apologies for crimes I couldn't quite name yet. The beginning of the end came during our 8th anniversary dinner at Del Frisco's, the same restaurant where he'd proposed. We sat across from each other in awkward silence, him checking his phone between courses, me staring out the window at couples walking hand in hand on the 16th Street Mall. "Remember when we used to talk for hours?" I asked, setting down my barely touched salmon. He looked up from his phone with mild irritation. "We talk? About what? Your work schedule? The weather? When was the last time we had a real conversation about anything that mattered?" "Everything I do matters, Natalie. Just because you don't understand the complexity of what I deal with every day doesn't mean it's not important." That night, lying in bed while he scrolled through emails beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight for our marriage, but I was also going to stop making myself invisible in the process. I started with small changes. I joined a yoga class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. I accepted every freelance project that excited me, even if it meant working evenings. I bought clothes that made me feel confident instead of safe. I got highlights in my hair and started wearing lipstick again. Peter barely noticed, which told me everything I needed to know about where his attention was focused. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was in our home office, putting finishing touches on a website design for a local bakery, when Peter's laptop chimed with a FaceTime call. He was upstairs showering, and the sound echoed through our open concept house. I ignored it initially, but it kept ringing. Thinking it might be work-related and urgent, I called up to him. No response over the shower noise. The ringing stopped, then started again immediately. I walked over to silence it and saw the name on the screen, Victoria Sterling. I knew that name. Victoria was the new regional manager at Peter's company, a position created 6 months earlier when they'd expanded into the Wyoming market. Peter had mentioned her in passing, brilliant, ambitious, everything the company needed for their growth phase. What he hadn't mentioned was that they were FaceTiming at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. The call ended before I could decide whether to answer it. I stared at the laptop screen, my heart pounding with a suspicion I'd been trying to suppress for months. When Peter came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair still damp, I was back at my desk pretending to work. "Everything okay?" he asked, toweling his hair. "Fine," I replied, my voice steadier than my hands. "Your laptop was ringing. Victoria Sterling?" He paused for just a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching carefully. "Work stuff. I'll call her back tomorrow." But he didn't wait until tomorrow. At 10:47 p.m., after I'd gone to bed, I heard his muffled voice from the office downstairs. I crept to the top of the stairs, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, and listened to fragments of conversation that made my stomach clench. "Can't wait to see you in Phoenix. Told Natalie it's a client presentation. You're everything I've been missing." I made it back to our bedroom before my knees gave out, sitting on the edge of our marriage bed while the foundation of my life cracked beneath me. But instead of confronting him immediately, instead of screaming or crying or demanding explanations, I did something that surprised even me. I started planning. The next morning, while Peter showered and prepared for another day of deceiving me, I opened my laptop and began researching Victoria Sterling. Social media, company directory, professional networking sites. Within an hour, I had a comprehensive picture of the woman my husband was betraying me for. Victoria Sterling was 32, 3 years younger than me, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of sharp, angular beauty that photographed well. Her LinkedIn profile showed an impressive career trajectory: Harvard MBA, previous executive positions at Fortune 500 companies, a track record of turning around struggling divisions. Her Instagram, set to public with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, painted the picture Peter had undoubtedly fallen for. Photos from 5-star restaurants, first-class airplane seats, designer workout clothes from expensive gym sessions. She was what some men would call a real woman, successful, polished, unapologetically ambitious. She was also married. The wedding photos were from just 2 years earlier, a lavish affair in Napa Valley. Her husband, Richard Sterling, appeared to be older, distinguished, with silver hair and the soft look of inherited wealth. The kind of man who could afford to keep a wife like Victoria in the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, which made her affair with my husband infinitely more interesting. Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage. I tracked Peter's schedule, noting discrepancies between his stated plans and his actual whereabouts. I monitored our credit card statements, finding charges at restaurants and hotels that didn't match his supposed business itinerary. The Phoenix trip was scheduled for the first week of April. Client presentation, he'd told me, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of a man convinced his wife suspected nothing. I waited until he left for the airport, then called his office. "Hi, this is Natalie Parker. I'm trying to reach my husband, Peter O'Brien, but I think I have the wrong contact information for his Phoenix client. Could you help me with the correct number?" The receptionist, Karen, had always liked me.
We'd chatted at company holiday parties about her grandchildren and my design work.
Phoenix client? She repeated, her voice puzzled. Honey, Peter is in Denver all week. We've got the quarterly review meetings starting tomorrow. I thanked her calmly and hung up, then immediately booked a flight to Phoenix. The Ritz-Carlton in downtown Phoenix gleamed in the desert sun as I checked in under my maiden name, Parker. I'd called earlier, claiming to be Victoria Sterling's assistant, confirming their reservation. Room 1247, registered under Sterling, checking in that afternoon. I spent the day shopping, buying an outfit I'd never normally choose, a sleek black dress that hugged curves I'd forgotten I had, heels that made me 3 inches taller, makeup that transformed me from suburban wife to someone who could hold her own in any room. At 7 p.m., I positioned myself in the hotel bar with a clear view of the elevator bank. I ordered a martini, something I'd never done in my life, and waited. They appeared at 7:23, Peter's hand on the small of Victoria's back as they emerged from the elevator. She wore a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her platinum hair styled in loose waves that caught the lobby lighting perfectly. They were absorbed in each other, Peter animated in a way I hadn't seen in years, Victoria laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear. They looked like a couple from a magazine ad, successful, attractive, completely comfortable in their expensive clothes and expensive surroundings. I took a photo with my phone, then another as they headed toward the restaurant. Then I followed them. The hostess seated them at a corner table, intimate and secluded. I requested a table across the restaurant with a clear sightline, claiming I was waiting for someone who might be running late. For 2 hours, I watched my husband of 8 years court another woman. He pulled out her chair, poured her wine, leaned across the table to touch her hand as they talked. He was performing the role of devoted suitor with an enthusiasm that made my chest ache with recognition. He'd done all these things for me once, in what now felt like another lifetime. When they stood to leave, his hand finding that familiar spot on her lower back that had once been reserved for me, I felt something shift inside me. Not the desperate heartbreak I'd expected, but a cold, clarifying anger that sharpened my focus like a lens coming into focus. I followed them back to the elevator bank, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. As the doors closed on their intimate conversation, I saw Peter lean down to kiss her neck, saw Victoria's eyes close in response. Back in my room, I uploaded the photos to a secure cloud folder, then called room service and ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. If I was going to plan the end of my marriage, I was going to do it properly. The next morning, I flew back to Denver and resumed my role as the unsuspecting wife. Peter returned that evening with gifts, a turquoise bracelet that was so you, he said, and stories about the difficult client who'd finally agreed to terms after 2 days of intense negotiations. I smiled and thanked him for the bracelet, asked interested questions about his fictional client, and began phase 2 of my plan. I'd learned from observation that direct confrontation with cheating spouses often led to gaslighting, manipulation, and prolonged emotional warfare. Peter was a skilled salesman who could talk his way out of almost anything. But I'd also learned that sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't immediate retaliation, it's strategic patience. I followed them back to the elevator bank, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. As the doors closed on their intimate conversation, I saw Peter lean down to kiss her neck, saw Victoria's eyes close in response. Back in my room, I uploaded the photos to a secure cloud folder, then called room service and ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. If I was going to plan the end of my marriage, I was going to do it properly. The next morning, I flew back to Denver and resumed my role as the unsuspecting wife. Peter returned that evening with gifts, a turquoise bracelet that was so you, he said, and stories about the difficult client who'd finally agreed to terms after 2 days of intense negotiations. I smiled and thanked him for the bracelet, asked interested questions about his fictional client, and began phase 2 of my plan.
I'd learned from observation that direct confrontation with cheating spouses often led to gaslighting, manipulation, and prolonged emotional warfare. Peter was a skilled salesman who could talk his way out of almost anything. But I'd also learned that sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't immediate retaliation. It's strategic patience.
I started with my finances. Over the next month, I quietly transferred my freelance income to a separate account, claiming I needed better bookkeeping for tax purposes. I made copies of all our important documents, secured my grandmother's jewelry and family photos, and researched divorce attorneys with reputations for protecting women's interests. But more importantly, I started rebuilding myself. The yoga classes became rock climbing lessons. The highlights became a dramatic new haircut that framed my face in ways that made strangers do double takes. I joined a photography group, something I'd always wanted to explore but had never made time for during my marriage to a man who dismissed my interests as hobbies. It was at one of these photography meetups that I met David Chen. David was 35, a freelance photojournalist who'd moved to Denver from San Francisco after a messy divorce of his own. He had dark hair that fell over his eyes when he laughed, hands that moved expressively when he talked about his work, and a way of listening that made whoever was speaking feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was also devastatingly handsome in a way that was completely different from Peter's polished perfection. Where Peter was all sharp angles and controlled presentation, David was warm eyes and genuine smiles, worn leather jacket, and stories about capturing moments of real human connection through his camera lens. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, long after the photography group had disbanded and moved to a nearby coffee shop. We talked about art, travel, the books we'd read, and the places we dreamed of visiting. He told me about his work documenting social justice movements across the country, the way photography could tell stories that words couldn't capture. "What about you?" he asked as we walked to our cars in the parking lot. "What stories are you trying to tell?" I paused at my Subaru, keys in hand, considering his question more seriously than he probably intended. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "I think I'm still figuring out what my story is." He smiled, a expression that transformed his entire face. The best stories usually start with someone figuring out they've been living someone else's narrative. That night, I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband and thought about David's words. For 8 years, I'd been a supporting character in Peter's story, the devoted wife, the woman behind the successful man, the person who made his dreams possible while setting aside her own. But what if I started writing my own story instead? David and I began meeting regularly, initially under the pretense of photography collaboration. He was working on a series about gentrification in Denver neighborhoods, and I offered to help with design elements for his eventual exhibition. Our meetings were professional, appropriate, carefully maintained within the boundaries of friendship. But there was an undercurrent of possibility that neither of us acknowledged directly, a mutual recognition that in different circumstances, we might have been something more than collaborators. I told myself I wasn't cheating. Peter was the one having an affair. I was simply developing a friendship with someone who appreciated my mind, my creativity, my potential. David never asked about my marriage directly, but he had the intuitive understanding of someone who'd navigated his own relationship dissolution. "You know," he said one afternoon as we reviewed contact sheets in his downtown studio, "you have incredible instincts for visual storytelling. Have you ever considered doing this professionally?" I laughed, thinking of Peter's dismissive comments about my little projects. "I'm just a hobbyist." David looked up from the photos, his expression serious. "Says who?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a revelation. Says who, indeed? Who had decided that my interests were hobbies rather than potential careers? Who had determined that my dreams were less important than my husband's ambitions? That evening, I researched photography programs at local colleges, looked into professional development workshops, calculated what it would cost to pursue something I genuinely loved rather than something that simply paid bills. Peter noticed none of these changes. He was too busy with his own secret life, his mysterious work trips that were becoming more frequent, his evening phone calls that required privacy. He'd started going to the gym more often, updating his wardrobe, taking more care with his appearance. The signs were so obvious I wondered how I'd missed them initially, then realized I hadn't missed them at all. I'd simply chosen to ignore them because acknowledging them would have required action I wasn't ready to take. But I was ready now. In early June, Peter announced another business trip. Seattle this time, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. New market research project. I'll be gone for 5 days. I nodded sympathetically, asked appropriate questions about his workload, and began planning my own trip. Victoria's social media had become my inadvertent source of intelligence. She posted regularly, workout selfies, restaurant check-ins, professional achievements. She'd been posting from Seattle all week, supposedly attending a conference on market expansion strategies. But she wasn't staying at the conference hotel. I'd become adept at reading between the lines of her carefully curated posts. The restaurant photos showed expensive meals for 2, though she was always alone in the selfies. The hotel room glimpses revealed luxury accommodations that exceeded typical corporate travel budgets. This time, I didn't follow them. Instead, I used those 5 days to accelerate my preparations. I met with Diana Rodriguez, the divorce attorney I'd been researching, and laid out my documentation of Peter's affair. Diana was impressed by my thoroughness, the photos, the credit card records, the timeline of deceptions. "You've built a solid case," she said, reviewing my files. "Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, but evidence of infidelity can still influence property division, especially when marital assets have been used to support the affair." I also spent those 5 days with David, not romantically, but in a concentrated burst of creative collaboration that felt like awakening from a long sleep. We worked on his exhibition proposal, created a portfolio of my photography work, and planned out what my life might look like if I stopped being afraid of wanting things for myself. "You're different," he observed on the last day as we organized prints for his upcoming gallery showing. "More present, somehow." "I'm remembering who I used to be," I replied, before I convinced myself I was only half of something instead of a whole person. When Peter returned from Seattle, he was practically glowing with satisfaction. He brought me expensive chocolate and stories about breakthrough presentations, successful client meetings, and promising new business relationships. He also brought home a new cologne, one that smelled like Victoria's Instagram photos looked, expensive and sophisticated. That night, as he slept beside me, I made my final decision. I would wait until the perfect moment presented itself, then end our marriage on my terms, in a way that left him with no room for manipulation or gaslighting. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Peter's company was hosting their annual summer gala in late July, a black tie affair at the Denver Art Museum that celebrated their biggest clients and most successful employees. Peter had been selected to give a presentation about market expansion initiatives, recognition that filled him with pride he couldn't quite contain. "This could be the presentation that gets me promoted to senior vice president," he told me as we prepared for the event. "Victoria thinks my proposal has real potential to reshape how the company approaches new markets." He said her name with casual familiarity now, no longer bothering to hide his admiration for her professional insights. I wondered if he realized how much he revealed with that simple comment, or if he was so comfortable in his deception that he'd stopped monitoring his words around me. I'd chosen my dress carefully, midnight blue silk that brought out my eyes, with a neckline that suggested confidence without screaming for attention. My new haircut had grown out slightly, framing my face in soft waves that caught the light when I moved. David had helped me practice photography techniques for capturing candid moments, and I'd brought a small, professional-grade camera to document what I suspected would be a memorable evening. The museum was transformed for the gala, with dramatic lighting and carefully positioned art pieces creating an atmosphere of sophisticated elegance. I moved through the crowd with Peter, playing the role of supportive wife while mentally cataloging the guest list and mapping out strategic positions for what I planned to do. Victoria arrived fashionably late, wearing a stunning red gown that probably cost more than some people's monthly salaries. She was alone. Richard was apparently traveling for business, and she commanded attention the moment she entered the main gallery.
I watched Peter watch her enter, saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his conversation faltered mid-sentence as his attention focused entirely on her approach. "Peter," she said, air kissing his cheek with practiced intimacy, "you look handsome tonight." "Victoria, you remember my wife, Natalie," Peter said, his arm sliding around my waist in a possessive gesture that felt more like performance than affection. "Of course," Victoria smiled, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Natalie, that dress is beautiful. You look lovely tonight." Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced, her eye contact just long enough to seem genuine without revealing anything real. She was everything Peter had said she was: polished, professional, completely in control of how she presented herself to the world. She was also studying me with the subtle assessment of someone trying to understand her competition. "Thank you," I replied, matching her smile with one of my own. "I've heard so much about your work on the market expansion project. Peter speaks about your insights constantly." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the wife knew details about their professional collaboration. Or maybe recognition that I was not quite the naive, unsuspecting spouse she'd expected. "It's an exciting project," she said carefully. "Peter brings a unique perspective to the challenges we're facing." "I'm sure he does," I thought, but said instead, "He's certainly been energized by the work. All those late nights and weekend strategy sessions have really paid off." Peter shifted beside me, his arm tightening slightly around my waist. There had been no weekend strategy sessions that I knew of, but Victoria's slight smile suggested she understood the subtext of my comment. "Dedication is so important in our line of work," she agreed. "Sometimes the best insights come from those intensive collaboration sessions." We could have continued this careful dance of innuendo indefinitely, but Peter chose that moment to excuse himself to greet other colleagues, leaving Victoria and me alone in the midst of the crowded reception. "Your husband is very talented," she said, watching him work the room with practiced charm. "Yes," I agreed. "He's always been good at getting what he wants." She turned back to me, her blue eyes assessing. "And what do you want, Natalie?" It was a direct question, unexpected in its honesty. I considered my answer carefully, aware that whatever I said next would likely be reported back to Peter. "I want to be happy," I said finally. "Really, genuinely happy. Not just comfortable or secure, but actually fulfilled." "And are you? Happy, I mean?" I smiled, an expression that felt more genuine than any I'd worn in months. "I'm getting there." Our conversation was interrupted by the announcement that dinner was being served, but I caught something in Victoria's expression that suggested she'd heard more in my words than I'd explicitly said. During dinner, I positioned myself with a clear view of both Peter, who was seated at the head table due to his presentation role, and Victoria, who was at a nearby table with other senior executives. I watched them navigate the careful balance of public interaction, professional courtesy that revealed nothing, while suggesting everything to anyone who knew what to look for. They were good at the deception, I had to admit. No lingering glances, no inappropriate touches, no obvious signs of intimacy. But there was a synchronization to their movements, a way they seemed to exist in each other's peripheral awareness, even when focused on other conversations. Peter's presentation was scheduled for after dinner, during the awards ceremony portion of the evening. I'd heard him practice it multiple times, knew it by heart. A comprehensive overview of market expansion opportunities that positioned him as the visionary leader the company needed for their next phase of growth. What he didn't know was that I'd invited a guest to attend the presentation. David arrived during the cocktail hour after dinner, looking sophisticated in a tailored black tuxedo that transformed him from casual photographer to someone who belonged in this elevated setting. He'd agreed to attend as my photography assistant, documenting the evening for what I told him was a potential freelance project about corporate culture. "Impressive event," he murmured, as I introduced him to various colleagues and spouses. "Your husband certainly works with successful people." Success is relative, I replied, adjusting his tie with the casual intimacy of someone comfortable in his presence. Sometimes what looks like achievement from the outside is actually just elaborate performance.
Peter noticed David's presence immediately, his presentation preparation interrupted by curiosity about who this stranger was and why his wife was so obviously comfortable with him. "Peter," I said, approaching with David in tow, "I'd like you to meet David Chen. He's a photographer I've been working with on some projects. David, this is my husband, Peter." They shook hands with the careful assessment of men sizing each other up. Peter was taller, broader, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any room. But David had a quiet intensity that commanded attention without demanding it, a quality that made Peter work harder to establish dominance. "What kind of photography do you do?" Peter asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Photojournalism, mostly," David replied. "I document stories about social change, community transformation. Natalie's been helping me with some design elements for an upcoming exhibition." Peter's attention sharpened. "Exhibition?" "David's work is being featured at the Space Gallery next month," I explained. "It's a significant opportunity for emerging artists in the documentary photography field." I watched Peter process this information, trying to reconcile his dismissive attitude toward my creative interests with the evidence that I was collaborating with someone whose work was being professionally recognized. "That's interesting," he said finally, the word carrying just enough condescension to make his opinion clear. "Natalie's always been drawn to artistic hobbies." David's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd caught the insult embedded in Peter's casual dismissal. "I wouldn't call it a hobby," David said mildly. "Natalie has real talent for visual storytelling. Her instincts for composition and narrative are better than photographers I know who've been working professionally for years." The compliment, delivered in front of Peter with quiet conviction, created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Peter wasn't accustomed to other men praising his wife's abilities, especially not abilities he'd consistently minimized. "Well," Peter said, his smile becoming more forced, "I should probably prepare for my presentation. Natalie, why don't you show David around while I get ready?" It was a dismissal, an attempt to regain control of the situation by separating me from this unexpected source of validation, but it was also an opportunity. "Of course," I agreed. "David's particularly interested in corporate culture photography. I thought he might want to document some of tonight's networking interactions." As we moved away from Peter, David leaned close enough that his breath tickled my ear. "Interesting dynamic," he murmured. "You have no idea," I replied, my hand finding his arm with practiced ease. We spent the next hour moving through the reception, David actually taking photographs, while I pointed out notable guests and explained company hierarchies. To anyone watching, we looked like collaborators working on a professional project, but there was an undercurrent of intimacy in our interaction that couldn't be entirely hidden. I was aware of Peter watching us from across the room, his presentation preparation clearly suffering from his divided attention. I was also aware of Victoria watching Peter watch us, her expression thoughtful as she assessed this unexpected development. When the lights dimmed for the presentation portion of the evening, I positioned David and myself at a table with a clear view of both the podium where Peter would speak and the head table where Victoria sat with other executives. Peter's presentation began well. He was a natural speaker, confident and charismatic, able to command an audience's attention through sheer force of personality. His slides were polished, his arguments compelling, his vision for market expansion both ambitious and achievable. But as he spoke, I noticed his attention occasionally drifting to our table, his flow of words faltering slightly when he caught sight of David's camera or my encouraging smiles. Market expansion requires not just vision, but the courage to pursue opportunities that others might overlook, Peter was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the museum's sound system. Success in new markets demands adaptability, fresh thinking, and the willingness to embrace change, even when it means leaving familiar territory behind. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Peter was advocating for embracing change in business while desperately trying to maintain the status quo in his personal life, pursuing new territories with Victoria while expecting me to remain safely familiar and available. During the question and answer period following his presentation, I stood and raised my hand. Peter's eyes widened slightly as he recognized me, clearly not expecting his wife to participate in the professional discussion. "Yes," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for that compelling presentation," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "I'm curious about the timeline for implementing these expansion strategies. Specifically, how does the company plan to manage the integration of new market opportunities with existing commitments and relationships?" It was a legitimate business question, but phrased in a way that could be interpreted on multiple levels. Peter understood immediately that I wasn't just asking about corporate strategy. That's an excellent question," he said, his composure faltering slightly. "Integration challenges are always significant when expanding into new territories. It requires careful balance between pursuing new opportunities and maintaining existing relationships." He paused, his eyes meeting mine across the darkened room. "Sometimes, though, expansion requires making difficult choices about which relationships serve the company's long-term interests and which might be holding back progress." The room was completely silent now, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify, but recognizing the tension building between the presenter and his questioner. "I see," I replied, my voice steady. "And how does the company ensure that existing stakeholders, those who've invested time, energy, and resources in building the foundation for current success, are treated fairly during these transitions?" Peter's jaw tightened. "All stakeholders are valued," he said carefully, "but business expansion sometimes requires restructuring relationships to better serve evolving objectives." He paused, his eyes meeting mine across the darkened room. "Sometimes, though, expansion requires making difficult choices about which relationships serve the company's long-term interests and which might be holding back progress." The room was completely silent now, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify, but recognizing the tension building between the presenter and his questioner. "I see," I replied, my voice steady. "And how does the company ensure that existing stakeholders, those who've invested time, energy, and resources in building the foundation for current success, are treated fairly during these transitions?" Peter's jaw tightened. "All stakeholders are valued," he said carefully, "but business expansion sometimes requires restructuring relationships to better serve evolving objectives." I nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "Thank you for clarifying. It's always important to understand how organizations handle loyalty and commitment when new opportunities arise." I sat down to scattered applause, leaving Peter standing at the podium looking like a man who'd just realized he was playing a game whose rules had changed without his knowledge. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of networking and small talk, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. People approached me with new interest, curious about the woman who challenged the presenter with such pointed questions. David remained by my side, his presence serving as both support and subtle statement about my independence. Victoria approached us during the final reception hour, her red dress making her impossible to miss in the crowd. "Interesting questions during the presentation," she said, her smile carefully neutral. "You certainly have insights into market expansion strategies." "I've learned a lot about expansion recently," I replied, "both the opportunities and the costs involved in pursuing new territories." Her eyes flickered with understanding. "And your photography project?" she asked, nodding toward David. "That must be rewarding work, documenting real stories about change and transformation." David stepped slightly closer to me, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture that mirrored exactly how Peter had guided Victoria through the hotel lobby in Phoenix. "Natalie's been invaluable to the project," he said, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "She has an eye for capturing authentic moments, the kind of truth that can't be staged or performed." Victoria's smile became more genuine, tinged with what looked like respect. Authenticity is rare in professional settings, she observed. Most people are so busy managing their image that they forget who they actually are underneath all the performance. Some people, I agreed, watching Peter across the room as he accepted congratulations on his presentation from colleagues who hadn't caught the subtext of our exchange. Others are discovering that they're more interesting than they gave themselves credit for. As the evening wound down and guests began making their departures, Peter approached our table with the determined stride of someone preparing for confrontation. "Ready to head home?" he asked, his question directed at me, but his attention focused on David with poorly concealed hostility. "Actually," I said, standing and smoothing my dress, "I'm going to stay for a bit longer. David wants to get some shots of the museum's architecture for his project, and I offered to help with lighting setup." Peter's eyes narrowed. "It's nearly midnight, Natalie." "Is it?" I checked my watch with exaggerated surprise. Time flies when you're doing something you're passionate about. The word passionate hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made Peter's face flush with anger. "We should talk," he said through gritted teeth. "We should," I agreed. "Tomorrow, perhaps, when we've both had time to process this evening's revelations." I kissed his cheek with the same casual affection he'd been showing me for months, then turned back to David with a smile that was anything but casual. "Shall we get started on those architectural shots?" As we walked away, I heard Victoria's voice behind us, soft but carrying clearly in the museum's acoustics. "Peter," she said, and something in her tone made me pause. "I think we need to talk as well." David and I spent the next 2 hours in the museum, long after the last guests had departed. We weren't taking photographs. Instead, we sat on a bench in the contemporary art wing, surrounded by pieces that challenged conventional perspectives, and I told him everything. About Peter's affair, about my months of detective work, about the careful documentation and strategic planning, about feeling invisible in my own marriage, and discovering that invisibility could be a form of power when wielded correctly. "So what happens now?" David asked when I finished, his voice gentle in the museum's hushed atmosphere. "Now I wait for Peter to make his choice," I said, "and then I make mine." The choice came sooner than expected. I arrived home at 2:30 a.m. to find Peter waiting in our living room, still in his tuxedo, but with his bow tie undone and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I agree. I sat across from him in the chair I'd claimed as mine during our months of growing apart, the physical distance between us feeling like a chasm. "Who is he?" Peter demanded. "Who is she?" I countered. We stared at each other across our expensive coffee table, two people who'd once promised to share everything, now reduced to strategic questioning. "I don't know what you think you know," Peter began. "Victoria Sterling," I interrupted. "Phoenix, Seattle, the Ritz-Carlton, room 1247. Would you like me to continue, or shall we skip to the part where you explain why you think I'm not enough anymore?" Peter's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned defiance. "How long have you known?" "Months. The question is, how long has it been going on?" He leaned back against the couch, his formal shirt wrinkled, and his carefully maintained facade cracking. "Since February." "And tonight? What did Victoria want to talk to you about after the gala?" Peter's silence stretched long enough that I had my answer before he spoke. "She's ending it," he said finally, his voice hollow. "She said seeing you tonight made her realize she was making a mistake, that she has too much to lose, and that watching you challenge me during the presentation showed her something about who you really are versus who I'd described you as." I felt a surge of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. "And what had you described me as?" "As settled, comfortable, someone who'd lost her spark." He looked up at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. "But tonight, you were different, confident, like the woman I married, but stronger somehow."
I am stronger, I said simply. I had to be to survive being married to someone who stopped seeing me as a person worth knowing. Natalie. No, I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the weight of months of pretending. You don't get to rewrite history now that your affair is over. You chose Victoria because you thought she was everything I wasn't. Ambitious, polished, exciting. You chose her because you decided I was boring and insufficient. The fact that she chose not to choose you doesn't change what you did to our marriage. Peter stood as well, reaching toward me with the desperate gesture of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. It doesn't have to end this way. We can fix this. I can fix this. How? I asked, genuinely curious. How exactly do you fix 8 months of lies and betrayal and emotional abandonment? How do you fix telling another woman that your wife isn't enough while sharing intimate dinners and hotel rooms and pieces of yourself that you'd stopped sharing with me? I made a mistake. You made choices, I corrected, dozens of them. Every time you called her instead of coming home early to spend time with me, every time you lied about where you were going and who you were with, every time you bought her gifts and brought me guilt presents, every time you made love to me while thinking about her. Peter flinched at that last observation, confirming what I'd suspected about the distance I had felt, even during our increasingly rare moments of physical intimacy.
What about him? Peter asked, deflection replacing attempted apology. David, are you having an affair too? I considered my answer carefully. David is someone who sees value in me that you stopped noticing years ago. He's someone who treats my interests as legitimate rather than as cute hobbies. He's someone who makes me remember what it feels like to be appreciated for who I am, rather than tolerated for what I provide. So, yes, you are having an affair. No, I said firmly. I'm having a friendship with someone who reminds me that I'm worth more than you've been willing to offer. But I haven't betrayed our marriage vows, Peter. That distinction belongs entirely to you. We stood in our living room, surrounded by the artifacts of our shared life, wedding photos, vacation souvenirs, furniture we'd chosen together during happier times, and I felt the finality of the moment settling around us like dust. I want to try again, Peter said, his voice breaking slightly. I want to fight for us. Where was that fight for the past 2 years? I asked. Where was it when I tried to talk to you about feeling disconnected? Where was it when I suggested counseling? When I planned romantic dinners you were too busy to attend? When I begged you to help me understand why we'd become strangers living in the same house? Peter had no answer, because we both knew the truth. He only wanted to fight for our marriage now that he was losing it, only wanted to value what he had after he'd thrown it away for something that turned out to be an illusion. I'm filing for divorce, I said quietly. I've already retained an attorney. I have documentation of your affair, evidence of how you've used our joint assets to support your relationship with Victoria. I'm prepared to be fair about property division, but I won't be pushed around or gaslit into accepting less than I deserve. Natalie, please. I'm done being someone's backup plan, I said, moving toward the stairs. I'm done being the safe choice, the comfortable option, the woman who's supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to spare from your exciting new life. I'm worth more than that, Peter. I always was. I paused at the bottom of the staircase, looking back at the man I'd married with such hope and optimism. The irony is that if you'd fought for me a year ago, if you'd put half the energy into our marriage that you put into pursuing Victoria, we might have had something worth saving. But you didn't want the woman you married. You wanted someone new and exciting. Well, now you can have that, just not with me, and apparently not with her either. I left him sitting in our living room, still in his wrinkled tuxedo, staring at the ruins of the life he'd systematically dismantled while chasing something he thought would be better. The next morning, I woke up in our guest bedroom and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Diana Rodriguez, my attorney, confirming that I was ready to proceed with divorce proceedings. The second was to David. "How are you feeling?" he asked when I finished explaining the previous night's conversation.
Free, I said, surprising myself with the honesty of it. Sad, but free, like I've been holding my breath for months and can finally exhale. What happens now? Now I start over. I figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be half of something that stopped working years ago. And us? He asked carefully. What happens with us? I smiled, looking out the window at the Denver skyline where I'd built a life that was about to change completely. Now we get to find out what we could be when we're not sneaking around the edges of someone else's story. The divorce proceedings took 6 months, during which Peter oscillated between desperate attempts at reconciliation and bitter accusations about my relationship with David. Victoria, true to her word, ended their affair permanently, apparently deciding that a man who would betray his wife was not someone she could trust with her own heart or career. Peter tried to reach out to her several times, but she'd blocked his number and requested a transfer to the company's Chicago office. Her social media posts showed a woman doubling down on her marriage to Richard, posting photos of expensive couples therapy retreats and renewed wedding vows. Meanwhile, I moved into a downtown loft with exposed brick walls and enormous windows that filled the space with light. I enrolled in a professional photography program and started building a portfolio that combined my design background with David's mentorship in visual storytelling. The gallery showing of David's work became a celebration of new beginnings. My photographs were featured alongside his in a companion exhibition called Perspectives: Stories of Transformation. The opening night was packed with Denver's arts community, and I found myself in conversations about technique and vision and the stories that can only be told through images. Peter showed up uninvited, looking uncomfortable in the artistic crowd, but determined to make some kind of statement. He found me near my photograph of the museum's architecture from the night of the gala, an image that captured both the building's imposing grandeur and the intimate shadows where real conversations happened. I saw the exhibition announcement in the paper, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Your work is impressive. Thank you. I didn't elaborate, having learned that I didn't owe him explanations or emotional labor anymore. I wanted you to know that I'm seeing someone, he said. The words rushed as if he'd rehearsed them. Her name is Amanda. She's a marketing consultant. We met at a networking event. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man desperately trying to prove that he was moving on, that he was fine, that his choices had been justified. But there was something hollow in his eyes, a restlessness that suggested he was still searching for something he couldn't quite name. I hope you're happy, I said, and meant it, not because I wanted good things for him, but because his happiness or unhappiness was no longer my responsibility. Are you? He asked. Happy, I mean, with him? I glanced across the gallery to where David was explaining photojournalism techniques to a group of college students, his face animated with the passion he brought to everything he cared about. I'm happy with me, I said. David is part of that happiness, but he isn't responsible for it. I learned the difference. Peter studied my face as if looking for traces of the woman he'd married, the woman he'd decided wasn't enough. You have changed, he said, finally. I grew up, I replied. I stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission to want things for myself. He left shortly after that, and I watched him go with a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The man who'd broken my heart by calling me insufficient had become someone I genuinely pitied, not because he was alone, but because he was still chasing external validation instead of building something real from the inside out. 6 months later, I got a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Victoria Sterling. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, she said, her voice carefully polite. I got your number from your gallery's website. I wanted to apologize. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For participating in the destruction of your marriage, for believing Peter's characterization of you as someone who'd lost interest in growth and change, for not recognizing that a man who would lie to his wife would lie to his mistress as well. I was quiet for a moment, processing her words. What made you change your mind about the affair? Several things, she said, but mostly it was seeing you at the gala. The way you carried yourself, the questions you asked during Peter's presentation, the obvious respect and affection between you and David. It became clear that Peter had either been lying about who you were, or he'd stopped paying attention long enough that he'd missed your evolution into someone remarkable. Thank you for saying that. I also wanted you to know that Peter has been persistent in trying to resume our relationship. Even after I moved to Chicago, even after I made it clear that I was working on my marriage to Richard, he seems to think that since you're with David now, we can pick up where we left off. I wasn't surprised. Peter had always been someone who believed persistence could overcome any obstacle, that charm and determination could eventually wear down any resistance. How are you handling it? I've had to involve HR, Victoria admitted. It became harassment. But I also realized something important through this whole experience. I was attracted to Peter initially because he seemed like someone who knew what he wanted and went after it. But there's a difference between determination and entitlement. A man who will pursue what he wants, regardless of who he hurts in the process, isn't someone I can trust or respect. And your marriage? We're doing well, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Turns out almost losing something valuable makes you appreciate what you have. Richard and I are communicating better than we have in years. We're planning a trip to Italy this fall, something we'd talked about for years but never made time for. After we hung up, I thought about the strange turns life could take. A year ago, I'd hated Victoria Sterling as the woman who'd stolen my husband. Now I felt something approaching sympathy for her, and even a grudging respect for her willingness to apologize and change course when she recognized her mistakes. The final piece of the story came together 6 months after that, when David and I were having dinner at a restaurant in Lodo and ran into Amanda, Peter's new girlfriend. She was younger than me, probably in her late 20s, with the eager energy of someone still building her career and her identity. She approached our table hesitantly, clearly recognizing me from photos Peter had shown her. "You're Natalie," she said, her voice uncertain. "Peter's ex-wife." "I am," I confirmed, gesturing to the empty chairs at our table. "Would you like to join us?" Amanda glanced around nervously, as if Peter might appear at any moment to object to the conversation. "I probably shouldn't, but I wanted to meet you, to see if you were really the person Peter described." "And what did he describe?" Amanda sat down, her decision made. Someone who'd given up on life, someone who was content to coast on past achievements instead of building something new. Someone who was boring, I guess. David and I exchanged glances, and I saw him suppress a smile. "What do you think?" I asked Amanda. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the vibrant atmosphere of one of Denver's most dynamic neighborhoods, then back at David and me, with our obvious comfort in each other's company. "I think either Peter was lying, or he's really bad at paying attention," she said bluntly. "You seem like someone who has her life together in ways that most people would envy." "Thank you," I said. "Can I ask you something? Are you happy with Peter?" Amanda's expression became complicated. "I thought I was, but lately he talks about you a lot. About the divorce, about what went wrong, about how things would be different if he could do them over. And he started criticizing things about me, my career choices, my friends, my interests. Little things, but they add up. He's trying to make you into someone else," David observed quietly. "Someone who fits his evolving idea of what the perfect woman should be." "But the thing is," Amanda continued, "I don't think he actually knows what he wants. He just knows he wants something different from whatever he has. With you, he wanted someone more ambitious and exciting. With me, he wants someone more, I don't know, more settled maybe? More like what he says you used to be before you changed." I felt a wave of sympathy for this young woman who was discovering what I'd learned the hard way, that some people are perpetually dissatisfied, not because of their circumstances, but because of their inability to appreciate what they have. "Can I give you some advice?" I asked. Amanda nodded eagerly. "Don't try to become whatever version of yourself you think will make him happy. It won't work, because he doesn't actually know what will make him happy. And in the process of trying to be his ideal woman, you'll lose track of who you actually are." "But what if I love him?" "Then love him enough to be honest about who you are and what you need," I said. "And if he can't love the real you, not some edited version you think he wants, then he's not the right person for you."
Amanda thanked us and left, looking thoughtful and troubled. David and I finished our dinner in comfortable quiet, both of us processing the unexpected encounter. "Do you think she'll take your advice?" David asked as we walked back to his car. "I hope so," I said, "but probably not. She's young, and she probably thinks she can fix him or change him or love him into being satisfied. It took me 8 years to learn that you can't make someone value you if they're determined to take you for granted." "For what it's worth," David said, stopping under a streetlight to pull me close, "I think Peter is an idiot who lost the best thing that ever happened to him. Peter," I said, rising on my toes to kiss him, "is no longer my problem to solve." 3 months later, I wasn't surprised to receive a wedding invitation from Victoria and Richard Sterling, celebrating their renewed vows in Napa Valley. The card included a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me what it looks like to fight for something worth keeping. V." I was more surprised to get a call from Amanda, tearfully explaining that she'd ended things with Peter after catching him on dating apps, apparently hedging his bets while claiming to be committed to their relationship. "You were right," she said through her tears. "He doesn't know what he wants. He just wants to want something." The final chapter of this story came exactly 1 year after Peter had packed his bags and told me I wasn't enough anymore. David and I were celebrating the success of our joint photography exhibition, which had led to offers for commissioned work and a book deal documenting stories of personal transformation. We were at the same museum where Peter had given his presentation about market expansion, but this time we were there for a reception celebrating emerging artists in Denver's cultural scene. I was wearing a red dress that made me feel confident and beautiful, and David looked handsome in a suit that actually fit him properly. As we mingled with gallery owners, fellow artists, and collectors, I spotted a familiar figure across the room. Peter stood alone near the bar, looking uncomfortable in the artistic crowd, his eyes scanning the room with the restless energy of someone searching for something he couldn't identify. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and our eyes met across the crowded reception. For a moment, I saw recognition flash across his face, not just of who I was, but of who I'd become. The woman in the red dress, confident and laughing, surrounded by people who valued her work and her perspective, was not the woman he'd left behind. He started moving toward me, but David appeared at my side with 2 glasses of wine, his arms sliding around my waist with the casual intimacy of someone who belonged there. "Friend of yours?" David asked, following my gaze. "Former husband," I replied, accepting the wine. "The one who told me I wasn't enough anymore." David looked across the room at Peter, who had stopped his approach and was now studying us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Want to go talk to him?" David asked. I considered it, then shook my head. I don't think there's anything left to say. He made his choice about who I was and what I was worth. I've made my choice about who I want to be moving forward. Those are separate stories now. As if to underscore my point, the gallery director approached to introduce us to a journalist who wanted to feature our work in a magazine article about collaborative artistic partnerships. As we moved into that conversation, talking about our process and our plans for future projects, I lost track of Peter entirely. It wasn't until we were leaving, walking hand in hand toward David's car in the parking structure, that I realized the significance of the evening. A year ago, I'd stood in a similar museum, watching my husband court another woman while I felt invisible and insufficient. Tonight, I'd been the center of attention, celebrated for work I was passionate about, surrounded by people who saw value in what I brought to the world. "You know what the best part of tonight was?" I asked David as he opened my car door. "The fact that 3 different galleries want to feature your work? The fact that I didn't need Peter to see me tonight for me to know I was worth seeing," I said. A year ago, his opinion of me mattered so much that losing it nearly destroyed me. Tonight, I realized I'd forgotten he was even there until I happened to notice him. David smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still made my heart skip. "That," he said, "is what winning actually looks like." As we drove home through Denver's glittering skyline, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. Peter's affair had felt like the end of the world when I discovered it, but it had actually been the beginning of a much better story.
His rejection had forced me to rebuild my sense of self-worth from the ground up, to stop waiting for external validation and start creating value from the inside out. Victoria Sterling had been right when she'd called Peter persistent, but what she'd recognized and what Amanda was learning was that persistence without wisdom is just stubborn repetition of the same mistakes. Peter would probably continue searching for the perfect woman who would make him feel like the man he wanted to be, never understanding that the problem wasn't with the women he chose. It was with his inability to appreciate what he had while he had it.
6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Peter had gotten engaged to a woman named Sarah, a real estate agent who was apparently everything he'd been looking for. I felt no jealousy, no regret, just a mild hope that maybe this time would be different, though I suspected it wouldn't be. The real vindication came not from Peter's continued romantic failures, but from the life I'd built in his absence. David and I moved in together, combining his downtown studio with my loft to create a space that felt like home in ways my suburban house with Peter never had. We traveled for work and pleasure, documenting stories about resilience and transformation in communities across the country. I learned that enough had never been about meeting someone else's standards. It had been about recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept less than I deserved. The woman Peter had deemed insufficient was the same woman who now commanded respect in professional settings, whose work was featured in galleries, whose partnership with David was built on mutual admiration and shared values rather than convenience and compromise. The morning Peter had packed his bags and called me inadequate, he'd thought he was trading up, exchanging a comfortable but boring wife for an exciting and ambitious mistress. What he'd actually done was free me to discover that I was more interesting, more capable, and more valuable than either of us had realized. His real woman had recognized what he couldn't, that the problem in our marriage hadn't been my deficiencies, but his inability to see past his own dissatisfaction long enough to appreciate what he had. Victoria Sterling had chosen to work on her existing marriage rather than abandon it for something that looked more appealing from a distance. In the end, Peter's quest for something better had left him with a series of relationships built on the shaky foundation of dissatisfaction with the previous one. Meanwhile, I'd learned the difference between being chosen and being valued, between being wanted and being appreciated, between being enough for someone else and being enough for myself. The story Peter thought he was writing, successful man leaves boring wife for exciting new life, had become my story instead. Woman discovers her worth after being discarded by someone too limited to recognize it. His rejection had been the catalyst I needed to stop settling for less than I deserved, to stop making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurities. As I write this, 2 years after that morning when Peter told me I wasn't enough anymore, I can honestly say that he was right about one thing. I wasn't enough for him. But that was never about my inadequacies. It was about his inability to see value in anything he possessed long enough to nurture and appreciate it. I am enough, though more than enough. I'm enough for the work I love, for the partnership I've built with David, for the life I've created on my own terms. I'm enough for myself, which turns out to be the only opinion that really matters. And somewhere in Denver, Peter is probably telling his new fiancé that his ex-wife was someone who'd given up on growth and excitement, someone who was content to coast rather than strive for something better. He's probably explaining that he needed someone more dynamic, more ambitious, more real. What he'll never understand is that the most real thing about our entire 8-year marriage was the moment I stopped trying to be enough for someone who was constitutionally incapable of satisfaction and started being everything I was meant to be for myself. That's the story his real woman never got to hear, but it's the story I get to live every day. And it's better than anything he could have imagined when he walked away from what he thought was ordinary, only to discover he'd given up something extraordinary. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't making someone regret leaving you. It's building a life so fulfilling that you're grateful they freed you to find it.